Yesterday we learned Mishnah Vav, where the Mishnah discussed planting, for example. So what point in the 6th year can you plant? We do not want to plant anything in the 6th year that will take root in Tos v'Shviis, and certainly not in the 7th year, because if it's taking root during that period of time, it's as if you planted, and you're not allowed to plant in the 7th year. So we know that Tos v'Shviis, from the Halacha L'Moshe Sinai, Tos v'Shviis begins 30 days before Rosh Hashanah of the 7th year, which means about Rosh Chodesh Elul, and we don't want anything taking root in Rosh Chodesh Elul. So there were different opinions about how long you can plant during the 6th year. The first opinion held that it takes 30 days for a tree to take root. Therefore, you have to plant, you can only plant a tree up until 60 days before Rosh Hashanah, 30 days for the tree to take root, and then 30 days of Tos v'Shviis where it's not allowed to take root. So if, according to this opinion, if you would plant a tree 50 days before Rosh Hashanah, for example, you plant it on the 10th day of Av, day after Tisha B'Av, you plant the tree. Now the tree has about 19, 20 days in Av to take root, but it takes 30 days to take root, which means the tree is going to continue to take root for 10 days into Elul, and it's not allowed to take root during Elul because the 30 days of Elul are Tos v'Shviis. So the first opinion said that you have to, if you want to plant a tree in the 6th year, that's fine, but it has to be at least 60 days before Rosh Hashanah of the 7th year. The second opinion was Rabbi Yehuda. He said that a tree takes 3 days to take root, and therefore you have to plant the tree 33 days, at least 33 days before Rosh Hashanah of the 7th year. And the third opinion, which is the halacha, is Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon say that it takes root a tree takes root 14 days, it takes 14 days to take root, and therefore, if you want to plant a tree in the 6th year, that's fine, but it has to be at least 44 days before Rosh Hashanah of the 7th year. The 14 days that it takes to take root, and then 30 days for the Tos v'Shviis of Elul. So we were talking yesterday about taking root. And we also talked yesterday about the way that different fruits ripen on a tree at different times. And this makes a tremendous difference when we're trying to figure out what meiser do you give in a particular year. So for example, we're in the 6th year right now. In the 6th year, one who has fruits growing in his garden, for example, he's got a pomegranate tree. He picks his pomegranates, and what meiser does he take off? If you're either you take meiser or you're part of an organization that has the Pruta Chamura, however you're doing your trumas and meisers, what meiser do you take off this year? It's the 6th year. The pomegranates on the tree may have blossomed last year in the 5th year, and you're picking them in the 6th year. Those are 5th year pomegranates, not 6th year pomegranates. If they blossomed this year, then they're 6th year pomegranates. And the difference is, in the 5th year, you take off meiser rishon that goes to a Levi. We just take off the meiser, we don't give it to a Levi today. You take off the meiser rishon, and if it's 5th year fruit, 5th year pomegranate, you take off the meiser rishon for the Levi, and meiser sheni that you would, when the Beis Hamikdash stood, b'me'erev yameinu, you would take to Yerushalayim and eat. That's if it's a 5th year pomegranate. If it's a 6th year pomegranate, you're going to take off meiser rishon to give to the Levi, and you're not going to take off meiser sheni to take to Yerushalayim. You're going to take off some pomegranates and give it to a poor person, meiser ani. So you can be looking at a pomegranate tree in the 6th year, and what's on the pomegranate tree are 5th year pomegranates, and the halachas are meiser of 5th year, even if you're picking it in the 6th year. It could be the pomegranates blossomed in the 6th year, and there's 6-year pomegranates. And we're going to see as we learn the coming Mishnah that in order to figure out what year something is it a 5th year, is it a 6th year, is it a 2nd year, is it a 3rd year, is going to depend on whether it's a vegetable bean, a vegetable slash bean, is it grain, is it fruit? And for this, we're going to learn Mishnah Zayin, and the halacha, the first halacha in Mishnah Zayin is an exception to all other cases of how you determine Maisa. In order to understand the Mishnah at this point, I think it's going to be easier for us to first learn the general rule and then learn the exception. Mishnah Zayin is talking about the exception. So let's learn the general rule. The general rule is brought down in the Rav on page 409 in the Mishnah Behira, the Rabbeinu Ovadia Mibar Tanura, on the right-hand column, and it's the last line in the Rabbeinu Ovadia Mibar Tanura on page 409. Afal Gav, even though the Be'ilan, and now we're flipping to page 410, the Be'ilan as linan bosachanata, when you want to figure out how to take meiser off from a tree that's growing fruit, we use the chanata rule. Chanata is blossoming. What does blossoming mean? We'll get to that. But the rule is blossoming. If it blossomed in the 5th year, even if you pick it in the 6th year, the picking is irrelevant. It's when it blossomed. If it blossomed in the 6th year, it's 6th-year pomegranates. If it blossomed in the 5th year, even if you pick it in the 6th year, it's 5th-year pomegranates. So with respect to a tree, the first rule the Rav tells us is bosa chanata. It's after it blossoms. What does chanata mean? So you have picture 54. There are different sheets what chanata is. We're going to get to that. I just want to get the general rule. Fruit, when it blossomed, that's the year of that fruit. Next rule. Ubiyerek, when you're dealing with vegetables, basa lakita. Then it depends when you pick the vegetables. If you pick the it doesn't make a difference what year the vegetable sprouted. It's when you pick it. If you pick it in the 5th year, it's 5th-year vegetables. If you pick it in the 6th year, it's 6th-year vegetables. We don't care when they sprouted or, to use the word, blossom. We only care about when you picked it. So a fruit tree is when the fruit blossomed. Vegetables slash beans, when you actually pick them. Third rule, uvetvua v'zeisim, when you're dealing with grain and olives, bosa shlish. Why are olives an exception? We're going to leave that for now. As we learn the general rule, we're going to understand more and more about why we have 3 different time periods. Grain and olives, the year of the grain for Maisa, the year is when it grew 1/3. So there's a picture on page 411, page 56. It gives you a hypothetical picture of a fully grown stalk of grain or wheat. And next to it is a small picture of the same stalk of grain. It's a third. They're trying to just show you in a picture. Fully grown versus 1/3 grown. The year in which a grain reaches 1/3 of its growth, that's the year of the grain. So if it reached 1/3 of growth in the 5th year, and it didn't reach full growth till the 6th year, it is 5th-year grain. It's when it reached the 3rd. So we have 3 general rules. How do I know what year I'm in for Meiser? So if it's a fruit growing on a tree, when did the fruit blossom? It doesn't make a difference when you pick it, it's when it blossomed. Rule number 2, vegetables. It doesn't make a difference when it's sprouted, it's when you picked it, lakita. And then we have the 3rd rule of grain and olives, when they grew 1/3, that determines the year of its Maisa. Now we're going to come back to this Rav, and now let's learn the Mishnah on page 408. We're going to have 4 exceptions to the 3 rules. There are only 3 rules: blossoming for fruit trees, picking for vegetables, and 1/3 growth for grain and olives. And now we're getting a whole new rule. This is what we would call the 4th rule, or the exception to the 3 general rules. Ha'orez, rice; hadochen, millet; pragim, poppy; pereg. You go into the bakery, there's ugot, pereg, poppy; vahashumshamin, and sesame. You're growing rice, millet, poppy, or sesame, and you need to know what year this what's growing in your field. Is it 50-year poppy? Is it 50-year sesame? Is it 50-year rice or 60-year? Shehishrishu lifnei Rosh Hashanah. For these 4 things, we're only concerned when they took root. We don't care when they sprouted. We don't care when you picked them. It's when they took root. Okay, there's a picture of what would be considered taking root. Farmers knew how to do this. I'm not sure how to do it. But when these 4 things took root, they're giving you pictures in number 53. You plant the seed and the little roots come out from the bottom. So now we have a 4th rule, or an exception to the 3 rules. Fruits of a tree blossom determines Ma'aser. Vegetables, picking them determines Ma'aser. Grain and olives, 1/3 growth determines Ma'aser. Rice, millet, poppy, sesame, it's when it took root. So the Mishnah now says, Ha'orez v'hadochan v'haprogim v'hashumshemim shehishrishu lifnei Rosh Hashanah. If they took root before Rosh Hashanah, misasrim l'sha'ova. So we're not talking about Shemitah yet. Let's make believe tomorrow is Rosh Hashanah. And 2 or 3 days ago, I planted a field full of poppy. And the poppy took root. Now it's Rosh Hashanah. And the Rosh Hashanah is the Rosh Hashanah for the 6th year. Let's leave Shemitah out of this for the moment. I planted a poppy field 2 or 3 days before Rosh Hashanah, and it was the 5th year. Tomorrow's Rosh Hashanah, and it becomes the 6th year. And the poppies took root during the 2 or 3 days before Rosh Hashanah. Those poppy seeds that grow, you take off Meiser as if it was the 5th year. Meiser Rishon for the Levi, Meiser Sheni take to Yerushalayim. Because here the rule is for these 4 items, when it took root, that determines the year for Meiser. And now the Mishnah adds the halacha about Shemitah. Umutarim b'Shviis. If a person planted a poppy field, sesame field, rice field, millet field in the 6th year, even late in the 6th year, but it took root right before Rosh Hashanah, then you can pick and do what you want with these 4 items during Shemitah, because they're not considered Shemitah poppies or Shemitah millet or Shemitah rice or Shemitah sesame, because they took root in the 6th year. So therefore, they do not have Kedusha Shviis. So we have the rule of fruit, Chanata, vegetables, Likita, Tavua, grain, and olives, Shlish. And these 4 items, Hashrasha. Now the Mishnah says, V'imlav, and if they didn't take root in the 6th year, you planted them very late in Elul, and you know that it didn't fully take root, those poppies or the sesames or the rice or the millet, they didn't take full root in the 6th year. That means they're still forming their roots in the 7th year. Then there would be Asurim b'Shviis. These poppies, etc., would have Kedusha Shviis, and therefore it's prohibited for the owner of the field to treat them as if they're his, They have kedusha shvius. Umis asrim lishona haba. And in terms of meiser, the meiser is for the coming year. So if you planted these poppies at the end of the 5th year, and it didn't take root until the 6th year, those are 6th-year poppies, not 5th-year poppies. So now let's go back to the Rav on page 410 of your Mishnah Behira. He set out for us in the top left-hand corner the 3 rules: fruit, blossom, vegetables, picking, grain, and olives when they grow 1/3. And these 4 items are a new exception when they take root. And now the Rav explains, Mikol Mokom, the last of the wide lines in the Rav, Mikol Mokom, nevertheless, Ba'olez v'dochanu pargin v'shumshumin, with respect to rice, millet, poppy, and sesame, the ein loktin osam ke'echad, these are 4 items that Chazal recognized. Chazal recognized that they don't, even if you plant them together, they're not going to be collected together. Poppies, rice, millet, these kind of things, these 4 specific items, even when you plant them together, they sprout at different times, with the result that the farmer goes through his field at different times and collects them. He'll go out 1 week and collect the poppies that have ripened. And then a month later, he'll go out and collect more poppies that have ripened. What is the problem with that? Here's the problem. Let's take a case of poppies planted at the end of the 5th year. The farmer plants them, and there are some poppies already matured, ripened, and he takes a big basket, he collects his poppies. And then 2 or 3 weeks into the 6th year, he goes back into the field, and more poppies have ripened. And he starts collecting those poppies. And now he has 2 big baskets of poppies in his house. There's a confusion problem here, because since he collected them at 2 different times, if we're going to use the rule of collection as if it were a vegetable, he collected basket 1 in the 5th year and collected basket 2 in the 6th year, which means that these 2 baskets of poppies have 2 different rules of meiser, and you can't take off meiser for 1 year for something that grew in another year. You're not allowed to do that. You can't take off 5th year meiser for 6th year meiser. Everything that grew in a specific year, you take off meiser from that item for that year. So here, if you're dealing in a case of pomegranates, the tree is growing, basically, for the most part, the pomegranates will blossom, quote unquote, the halachic blossoming at one time. So you can look at the whole tree, and you know that these are pomegranates all together of year 5 or of year 6. You collect them, put them in your basket, bring them home, and you take off meiser. There's only 1 meiser for all those pomegranates, either 5th-year pomegranates or 6th-year pomegranates. But these 4 items, because they grow at different times, even when you plant them at the same time, they will grow and mature at different times. The farmer will be collecting some in the 5th year, some in the 6th year, or maybe some in the 1st year, some in the 2nd year. And now he has all these different baskets of poppies or rice in his house, and he'll start taking off meiser. He'll take his meiser out of basket 2 for all the baskets. He has 20 baskets of poppies that he collected at different times, and he'll take whatever the shiur is of meiser out of a basket, and he'll say, this is meiser for all the 20 baskets, and you can't do that because it was collected in different years. So we can't use collection. So the Rav now explains this. Since these things they blossom at different times, they're collected at different times, there's no way to make sure that the meiser is consistent, to make sure that all your baskets of poppies will be meisered for 1 year. Therefore, the rule became hashrosha. For these 4 items, they take root. You plant them all at one time. They take root basically at one time, and then they grow at different times. So we're looking for a common denominator so that we don't get confused. Is this fifth year or is this sixth year? So when we're dealing with fruits of a tree, the common denominator became blossoming. And now by using that common denominator, all the pomegranates blossom at the same time. All the dates blossom at the same time. And I won't get confused between fifth year buckets of dates and sixth year buckets of dates because they were all blossomed in 1 year and I kept them together. I can do the same thing by vegetables. I pick the vegetables at one time. The cucumbers sprout up at one time. I keep them together and I know these are fifth year cucumbers or sixth year cucumbers. When I get to these four things, I don't have a common denominator except for taking root. They all take root, these four items at the same time, but then they're off to the races. Some of them mature quicker and therefore they'll be picked earlier. Some of them mature slower, they'll be picked later. And I have a balagan in my house. Some of these are fifth year, some of these are sixth year, and then I'm going to take off Meiser and not know what I'm taking off Meiser. Is it fifth year, is it sixth year? Therefore, the Rav explains again on page 410. Mikol Mokom, nevertheless, ba'orez v'dochen upargin v'shumshumin, they ain't lokten osam ke'echad, they're not gathered together and collected at one time. Ve'ein maviyin shlish bishulam ke'echad, nor do they ripen 1/3. Why don't we use the grain? We have three rules. Blossoming, we can't use for these four items. They don't blossom together. They don't ripen together. We have collecting, the rule of vegetables. We can't use it here either because we don't collect them at the same time because they blossom at different times. We can't use the rule of grain because they don't grow 1/3 at the same time. They're all good. That's the point of these four things. They don't grow at the same time. So none of the three general rules work to create a common denominator for these four items. Therefore, the Rav says on page 11, Ein holchen bahem ela acha hashrosha. We do not follow for Meiser, for these four items, anything other than hashrosha, shorish. When did it take root? The meshana achas mushresh is kol hasader. Excuse me, the whole field will take root at one time. You plant a poppy seed field, the poppy seeds are going to take root at one time. That's the common denominator. After that, they're going to grow at different times, mature at different times, be collected at different times. I have no common denominator except for taking root, and that's how I know what the poppy seeds are. Are they 50-year poppy seeds or 60-year poppy seeds, 50-year rice, 60-year rice? I look for the common denominator. Only one there is hashrosha, taking root. These things are planted at one time. They take root at one time, and after that, there's no common denominator. So we have four rules for Meiser, which affect Shemitah. When we talk about Meiser, of the fruits of a tree, I look at when they blossom. When I'm talking about vegetables, I look when they were picked. When I'm talking about grain and olives, when they grew 1/3. And when I talk about these four items, poppy, sesame, rice, millet, I look at when they took root. That's how I figure out the Meiser. Now, when I go to Shemitah, I'm really using the same rules. I planted poppy, millet, rice, sesame in the 6th year, and I'm going to pick it in the 7th year. Is that Shemitah poppy or 6th year poppy? Answer, if it took root in the 6th year, that's it. It's 6th year poppy. We don't care if it matured in the 7th year. We don't care if you picked it in the 7th year. We don't care if it came to a third growth in the 3rd year, in the 7th year. We don't care. It took root in the 6th year. You have 6th year poppy, and you can do with it as you please as the owner of the field. If it took root in the 7th year, these are poppies of Shemitah, and you cannot treat them as if they're yours. They are full Kedusha Shviis. So we now have two sets of halachas that are based on one rule. We have the rule of how do I determine what year something is for Meiser, and how do I determine what year something is for Shemitah. Same rules. Fruit of a tree, blossom, vegetables, when you pick them, so you can take a case of vegetables. person plants potatoes, and we're not interested when the potatoes blossom. The potatoes may have blossomed, they're popping out of the ground. Erev Rosh Hashanah of Shemitah, they're popping out of the ground. They grew more, they're more than 1/3 grown. They're fully grown potatoes. Fully grown potatoes. But you decide you're not going to pick them until after Rosh Hashanah. So you pick the potatoes that were fully ripe in the 6th year, and you pick them in the 7th year. Those are Kedusha Shviis. Why? Because when we're talking about vegetables, we are talking about when you pick them. So this rule, these 4 rules, Chanata, Lakita, Shlish, Hashrasha, are rules for determining Meiser and rules for determining Shemitah. Now, what exactly is blossoming? So this is a very, very complicated halacha. It's the 2 major shittas are synopsized at the bottom of page 410. In the Ikar Mefarshim at the bottom of page 410, there's a bold word, chanata, at the end of the first of the wide lines. Chanata. L'Rambam, according to the Rambam paskins as follows. Chanata hainu shlish gidul. Chanata is defined as 1/3. If a pomegranate has grown to 1/3 of its size, a date, a fig, has grown to 1/3 of its size, that's called blossom. So if it came to 1/3 of its growth, 1/3 of its size in the 6th year, it's 6th year figs, dates, and pomegranates, even if you pick them in the 7th year. If it didn't get to 1/3 of its size until Shemitah, you're dealing with date, figs, and pomegranates that are Shemitah, and therefore they have Kedusha Shviis. So the Rambam holds that Chanata is defined as Shlish Gidel, 1/3 of the size of the fruit that's blossomed. Shahainu Zman Onas HaMaisus, because that's basically the rule of Meiser, where we talk about, for example, grain, and we talk about olives. That's the general rule of 1/3, and the Rambam now applies that to all fruits of the tree. 1/3 means blossom. However, Tosfos v'Harash, according to Tosfos and the Rash, Chanata hinu smadar. Chanata is what in Lashon Kodesh is a smadar. What's a smadar? Zman shehaperech nosher v'hapri nikar. It's the point of time that the leaves begin falling off the tree, the leaves that grow around the fruit, the leaves begin to fall off, and you can begin to recognize the fruit on the tree. That's much earlier than the Rambam. The Rambam holds the fruit itself must have grown 1/3. The Rash and Tosfos hold Chanata is the stage of a fruit that's called smadar, which is when the leaves the leaves that protect the fruits and they're falling off. That means the fruit can be recognized, and the fruit is mature enough because the leaves fell off. It's now mature enough. We're not talking about a hurricane came through. The leaves, and by the normal growth, the leaves are falling off. The fruits are now exposed, and that means the fruit's mature enough to be called chanata, which according to these Rishonim, Tosfos and Rash, means smada. Okay, those are the 2 sheets. I'd like to begin today, as we mentioned yesterday, in the back of the Sefer of the Mishnah Behira, there's a wonderful chart that summarizes Perek Aleph and Perek Beis through Mishnah Zayin, which we just learned. Mishnah Zayin, it doesn't really talk about Tosfos Shviis. But nevertheless, our discussion since we began Maseches Shviis has been about Tosfos Shviis. What can you do in the 6th? Are there any prohibitions in the 6th year leading up to the 7th year? And the answer was that we paskin like Rebbe Yishmael, that the prohibitions that apply in the 6th year are a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, And the halacha l'Moshe Sinai prohibits certain things to be done 30 days before Rosh Hashanah of Shemitah, which means about Rosh Chodesh Elul. And then the Chachamim, Beis Hillel said that, for example, plowing, you should stop at Shavuos, plowing a tree field. And plowing a grain field, you stop at Pesach. These are rabbinical rules that are extending the 30-day halacha l'Moshe Sinai. And we pass on like Rabbi Yishmael that the halacha l'Moshe Sinai was said only when the Beis Hamikdash is standing. So therefore, when the Beis Hamikdash is not standing, there's no din tos for Shviis, and these rules do not apply. You can do whatever you want in your field until Rosh Hashanah. We have Yameinu, Tzayim Hashem today. We'll see the Beis Hamikdash. We'll build the Beis Hamikdash, and these halachas will be relevant for us. So Perek Aleph and Perek Beis through Mishnah Zayin are summarized on page 517 of the Mishnah Behira. And this will summarize everything we learned about Tos for Shviis. Page 517 of the Mishnah Behira. Zaman mitzvah Shviis ha'aretz, the time where we're commanded to let the land rest. Tos v'Shviis, the additional tos v'Shviis, like we talked about tos v'Shabbos, we add to the Shabbos. We don't wait to the last minute of Shkia. We try not to. And we add 18 minutes or 30 minutes or 42 minutes. We add to Shabbos. We don't do work until Shkia. So there's a din of tos v'Shviis. Where does this din of tos v'Shviis come from? Top of the page. Tos v'Shviis ma'halacha l'Moshe Sinai. We paskin the tos v'Shviis is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. I'm now into the box next to it. Halacha keRebbi Yishmael. The halacha is like Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva disagree. Rabbi Akiva holds that tos v'Shviis is written in the Torah, in those three famous words that we talked about. Bechoresh uvakotzer tishbos. Rabbi Yishmael says that pasuk is not talking about Shemitah, and therefore tos v'Shviis is halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Shahamakor ledin tos v'Shviis shloshim yom. The source of the din of tos v'Shviis in the 6th year is 30 days. Hainu halacha l'Moshe Sinai. It's an oral transmission to Moshe. Ulisman hamikdash bovad, and it's only when the Beis Hamikdash is standing. V'hapasik b'choresh uvakotzer tishbos, and that pasuk, those three words that Rabbi Akiva says, teaches me tos v'Shviis. It's written in the Torah. Osik b'ktzir ha'omer adoch Shabbos. Rabbi Yishmael disagrees and says those three words have nothing to do with Shemitah. They teach me that Beis Din can cut down the barley if the 16th day of Nisan, the first day of Chol Hamoed Pesach, comes out on Shabbos, and you have to bring the Binchas HaOmer in the Beis HaMikdash. Beis Din can cut down that barley on Shabbos. Special pasuk to teach me that has nothing to do with Shemitah. Shemitah, the tos v'Shviis is halacha Moshe Sinai. La'asid lavoy sheyibana Beis HaMikdash meher v'yameinu, when the Beis HaMikdash is rebuilt, yachazor ha'isa l'makomo. The prohibition of tos v'Shviis will come back, and all these halachas will become extremely relevant this year. This year is the 6th year. What can we do Pesach? What can we do between Pesach and Shavuos? What can we do Shavuos? What can we do after Shavuos? What can we do 30 days before Rosh Hashanah? All these halachas will jump off the page, and they'll become alive for us to be able to live them. Im siyum shnas hashmita, when the 7th year ends, muteres miyad avodas ba'adam va'il. As soon as Shemitah is over, it's the Rosh Hashanah of the 8th year, quote unquote, immediately you're allowed to start working the ground and the trees. Imadayin metsuyin be'ilan perish Shviis. This is something we learned about, I believe, yesterday. What happens if it's the 8th year, it's the year after Shemitah, and you want to start working on a tree, and the tree still has fruits on it that blossomed in the 7th year? You have pomegranates blossomed in Shemitah. They're still on the tree in the 8th year, the year after Shemitah, those pomegranates are Kedusha Shviis. They blossom in the 7th year. They're not yours. They are for public consumption. Can you work on a tree, work on the bark, work on the roots, while there's still fruits of the 7th year on it? So it's the 8th year. You want to work on the tree, but the tree has 7th year fruits on it. Tanakama Oser, the first opinion the Mishnah says you may not work on that tree. Mepshul Maris Ha'ayin. People will see and suspect that you're working on the tree to help those fruits that are Kedusha Shvius, which you're not allowed to do. Rabbi Shimon Matir. Rabbi Shimon says you're allowed to work on the tree. Remember, we learned yesterday, this is the explanation of the Rav and others, that Rabbi Shimon and the Tanakama disagree about this point. From the Rambam, however, it's mashma that there is no disagreement on this particular point, and one may work a tree in the 8th year, do whatever he wants to the tree in the 8th year, even if it's carrying on its branches fruits of the 7th year. You can't do anything with the fruits, but one Shemitah is over, you can do whatever you want with the tree, and that's how the Rambam holds. So this is the Halacha L'Moshe Misinai. We now go one box below, Gezeirus Chachamim. What were the decrees that the Chachamim made in connection with the Tosfos Shvius? Chachamim gozru vekdimu isacharisha lepesach u'leshvus. The Chachamim added to the 30 days of the Halacha L'Moshe Misinai, and they said you can't plow once Pesach comes, which is a grain field, or you can't plow when Shavuos comes if it's a tree field. Zos b'mikrim, this halacha is in situations, shenira, we kept on saying it looks like, shenira kachoresh umechen hakarka l'tzorach hashana shvius. It looks like you're preparing the ground for the 7th year. So if it's a grain field, you cut all your grains by Pesach. Why are you plowing the field after Pesach? For what purpose? You want to seed it? Okay, now you're getting it ready for the 7th year. You can't plow a grain field after Pesach. If it's a tree field, and a tree field, the trees are growing there. They're not being cut down. Unlike a grain field, it's been cut down by Pesach. What are you plowing for after Pesach? A tree field, after Pesach, you still want to plow the field because you want to turn the soil over so that any moisture that's in the soil will seep down to the roots. Therefore, you're benefiting the tree for the 6th year. And you can do that till Shavuos. After Shavuos, where there's very little moisture left in the ground in Eretz Yisrael, why are you plowing the tree field? Because you want to benefit the ground, the tree, for the 7th year. That you can't do, that Tosfos Shvius. Mishacharav hamikdash ubatal din Tosfos Shvius me'atorah, bitlu chachamim gam gzeirosam zu. With the destruction, Nebuch, the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, there's no Tosfos Shvius of the 30 days, which is the Halacha L'Moshe Misinai. And once the Halacha L'Moshe Misinai is not there for the 30 days, the extension Chachamim gave it to Pesach and Shavuos is not there either. If the basis, the base of the 30 days, which is the Halacha L'Moshe Misinai, is not there because there's never no Beis Hamikdash, the extension of the base falls as well. So, Bizman she'ein Beis Hamikdash, there is no Tosfos Shvius, and one can do whatever he wants in this field until Rosh Hashanah. The next time we learn Maseches Shvius, we'll pick up with this chart. You can see the chart continues with the rules of a tree field, the rules of a sapling field. The next page talks about the grain fields. It talks about planting. It's a complete summary of Perek Aleph, Perek Beis through Mishnah Zayin of the halachas of Tosfos Shvius.